Я понимаю, что мне теперь все время страшно.
I
Мне
realize that I'm
страшно
scared
показывать
all the time
документы,
now.
потому что они у меня
I'm
с
scared to
собой.
show my
Я не хочу знать,
documents
там,
because
чьи
I
они
have changed
такие.
them,
Я
but I
выгляжу
haven't
очень
started
сильно
hormone
глупо. То
therapy
есть оно
yet,
не
and I
считывается.
look, let's say, awkward.
На улице, в
That
толпе
is,
я
in
тоже бы не
public, I
захотела
don't pass as
показывать.
the gender
Я
I
очень
would like
боюсь
to be.
теперь вообще
I'm very
всех
afraid of police
полицейских
officers,
больше,
even
больше,
more than I
больше.
was before.
Сейчас
I'm
я
currently
хочу
planning a few
поехать. Я
trips, and I
понимаю, что мне
realize that I'm
страшно
scared to
пересекать
cross the
границу.
border. I'm scared all the time. And I
Мне
understand
все
that's
время
probably what
страшно.
these
И я
people
понимаю,
who
что это
pass
то,
these
чего,
laws
наверное, эти
want to
люди,
achieve.
которые принимают эти законы, и хотели бы добиться.
This was Losha on his concerns about Russia's ban of the LGBT community. You're listening to Russia on the Record, a podcast from the Moscow Times. Russia's Supreme Court declared the international LGBT community extremist in a closed ruling late last month. The fact that no such community formally exists did not stop the Russian authorities. It is not yet clear what exact changes will come from the court's ruling. But Losha, whom you heard at the beginning of the episode, decided to take precautions in advance.
Я уже архивировал часть постов в Инстаграме.
I've already
Тоже
archived
касались
some of my
LGBT,
Instagram posts that
потому
address my
что я люблю,
identity
что
because I
такое
think that at the very least it could be
больше
considered
пропаганды,
propaganda
как бы
now.
будет
I think
больше
there will be more
говориться о том,
monitoring
что
of
скоро
LGBT
будет о
propaganda
пропаганде.
before the extremism law
Закон,
goes into
закон
effect.
обязательно вступит в
But I
силу.
also think
Еще я
this
думаю,
law
что
is
это не
going to
только
affect
LGBT
everybody one way or another,
что это
that this
регрессивное
repressive
направление, оно и
machine is not going to
останется
stop at the
в
LGBT
каком-то
movement.
движении, скажем
Let's just
так.
say that it's going to
Вот,
affect
против
everybody,
всех,
that they're going to
против
come after
движения, и
everybody.
потому что они
And
будут
because they
против
basically
всех.
want to come after
Сейчас
everybody,
очень
there's a lot
много
of talk
о
right now about
миграции, об
migration, about
эвакуации и
evacuation,
всем вот
about all of these
этом,
things.
но
But
мне
it's
очень
very
важно
important for me
понять
to stay in
ситуацию в
Russia right
России,
now.
и
And
я
I don't want to leave here
готова
for
без
as long as
последствий
possible.
добежать, вот пока
Until
сложно,
literally, I
наверное,
guess,
пока
it
как
gets
бы
so
не
bad that I
сделать так,
can't.
что я не
And I
смогу,
just
не
don't have
буду
that
после
choice,
этого
except
выбора,
for the choice
кроме того,
of,
как
I don't
выехать,
know,
можно
going to
пойти
prison
на
or
улицу или
leaving.
уехать,
Then
тогда,
I
тогда
guess,
я
yes,
уеду.
I will
В моем
leave.
случае я
Otherwise, I'm not
такой
really
вариант
considering the option of
не
moving.
рассматриваю.
Although, of course,
Я
everyone around
лично
me is
вокруг
already
меня уже все
saying that
говорят
I
о том,
should
что
apply
надо
for a
подаваться,
humanitarian
надо подаваться
visa
на
for refugee
гуманитарную визу,
status,
на
for
беженство,
anything.
на что угодно,
But
но
it's
я
fundamentally
чувствую,
important for
что
me to
как
stay
будто
here.
помощи я
Because
смогу
as an
дать больше,
activist,
если
I
буду
really want to
оставаться
help from here.
внутри
And I
самого
feel like I can
России.
give more
Но с
help if I
другой
stay within
стороны,
this
недавно я
context.
вот понял,
On the
что
other hand,
как
I
будто
recently
хочется
realized that
перестать
I feel like
развиваться,
I want to stop
когда
surviving, and I
ощущаешь
feel like I'm
какие-то
always in this
какие-то
mode
как
of
будто
some kind of
переживания,
survival and
постоянной
constant
адаптации.
adaptation. I
Хочется
just want to
уже
start living
быстрее
already.
жить.
And when I look at
И
how my
если
friends and
тебе какой-то
acquaintances have
друзья и
left and are
знакомые
just living their
уехали
lives,
и
I'm
просто
surprised
живут
because
свою
I don't have
жизнь,
this
я
opportunity. I
удивляюсь,
don't have the
потому что мне
opportunity
теперь явно
sometimes to hold the
становится
hand of a
очень
loved
тяжело.
one, to kiss in
Когда все
public if I
тянут друг
want
на
to.
человека,
I don't
все
know. I don't have the
целуются,
opportunity to put up a photo together,
хочется
even some kind of photo
ехать
that might fall
в
under the
какие-то
LGBT
Китаи, куда
propaganda law or
едут,
whatever. This
которые,
is, of
может
course, all
попасть
very
под законы
scary. And the worst part
ЛГБТ-граждан
is
и
that
так
this is
далее.
what they have been
Это,
trying to
конечно же,
achieve and
страшно, но
probably will
самое
achieve.
важное, что это то, чего они добивались и, возможно, добьются.
While Losha is not planning to leave Russia yet, many members of the LGBT community are considering it, like, for example, Timofey, who shared his concerns with us.
No one could be safe in Russia for now. No one of LGBT plus community, of course. I'm sure that the repression will not affect me. I'm an open gay, and it was very important for me during the years created some safe area around myself, and I had a coming out with my parents several years ago, and it's really difficult. It was difficult, and it's still difficult for now, because my parents, they love me, but when everybody around, including the government and the church, says that being gay is not normal, that it's a deviation, that it's a sin, what kind of exceptions can we talk about? Now the government has almost openly called all LGBT plus community as an extremist. And this is a very clear message. I have never posted about my sexuality, any posts on Instagram. There is no evidence that I was engaged in so-called propaganda. I guess I should be happy that I'm staying safe, but really I'm sad. As a journalist, I would like to be able to write about LGBT plus community, but it's now illegal in my country. I can't help but think about immigration. This seems to be the only opportunity now, and I will be looking for work or study opportunities abroad. This wasn't my strategy just a few years ago, but in 2023 it seems like the only option.
To more closely analyze the changes and risks for Russia's LGBT community under the new ban, we spoke with members of Russian NGOs that help queer people. Here is our conversation with Dilya Gafurova, head of the Sfera Foundation, and Alex Sasha Kaina from the Center T Transgender Rights Group. And in the suggestion to make LGBTQ communities extremists and such a quick adoption of the law come as a surprise to you?
Well, actually, it's not surprising at all. I think it's a logical step which follows many years of persecution of LGBT plus community and human rights community. In truth, however, of course, calling those who are LGBTQ plus, who somehow belong to the community, or activists, whoever the government assumes is these members of international LGBT movement, which doesn't exist, is extreme, ironically enough, because, well, how do you actually justify that? I guess the government doesn't really feel the need to justify it. It's just about sensationalizing people and politicizing them, unfortunately.
But it's not technically a law, is it?
It's a court decision.
It was a lawsuit. It was a lawsuit filed by the Ministry of Justice of Russia to the Supreme Court. And I think an interesting part of it is that this court process had no defendant, and the materials themselves are classified as secret. In other words, no one was allowed to attend the hearings themselves. And we do not even know which structural units of the so-called international LGBT movement were recognized as extremist. All we have is the final decision and general articles of the criminal code on extremism. And it actually did come as a surprise to me, not as a shock though. The moment they announced the court hearing on this decision, everyone knew it was going to happen. They did this with Navalny structures and some other groups. And some of these groups are real and some are rather fantastical, but in any case, consequences are extremely real. However, it's not very often we hear about such decisions, and we hear a lot of nasty things, but they do not always take this shape. It definitely, leaves an impression.
Why do you think the Russian authorities decided to pass it now in November 2023?
I would say that, again, this is about creating enemies, I would say, and we can assume this because on the day when the Russian Ministry of Justice announced that it actually applied with this lawsuit to the court, we saw multiple news segments coming out on pro-state federal channels. And during those news segments, they tried to link certain LGBT activists, sometimes people who haven't even been activists as such for many years, to extremist activity. They tried to say that, okay, they actually have something to do with anti-war movement, even if it's not true at all. They tried to make those links. So again, they tried to sensationalize this whole story and try to justify it. Why do that? Well, I guess the scariest part of repressions is you don't really know who they're coming after next or why. It just happens. I would want to say that the LGBT plus community, at least in my opinion, and activists who work to forward the rights of LGBT plus people, they are very vulnerable already. And maybe the government assumes that this is the easiest target. It's not really granted, I would say. It's just something that we might assume. There's no logic to this, not really. And I would also say that in this sense, people in Russia shouldn't just assume that, okay, the government is persecuting the LGBT plus community or the activists or whomever, and that's it. And that's where it's going to stop. No, this is really just one group that the government picks on. And it could be anybody. That's how it works in repressive regimes. So yes, this is a very, as Sasha has said, this is something very extreme. This is something very scary, but it is just one more big, yes, of course, a big step, but one more step in persecution of people within Russia. And I guess the government also wants to say that, okay, those who are LGBT plus, those who protect LGBT plus people, they are somehow agents of the West. They really love the term foreign agents, etc. So they're trying to say that this is all coming from the devil, well, I mean, the West, some sort of collective West, which is also an illusionary notion that doesn't really exist, and it's a concoction by the Russian government. And they're trying to explain away the existence of queerness, of different identities, trying to say that this doesn't belong to the Russian climate, to the Russian traditional values, which are also, like, what is that? What are traditional values? They cannot explain it. They cannot really pinpoint that. It's just part of state ideology. And it's very important for oppressive regimes to have ideology to continue existing.
Yeah, it's called an international LGBT movement for a reason. It's not called like a Russian LGBT movement. I actually think that this decision may be related to the upcoming presidential elections. Perhaps the Russian authorities want to get rid of any independent social activity. And I don't think that this is some kind of populist decision aimed at the majority of people. I would say that there was no request for such an initiative from Russian society. And yeah, this is obviously connected both with the war in Ukraine and with the opposition to the West. And also perhaps this is some kind of signal for countries that share Russia's ideas regarding LGBTQ people, because Russia really needs new friends.
Yeah, you mentioned that there is this international LGBT community mentioned in this new legislation. The new legislation is not even a law, so there are lots of like dark spots. This legislation is not very clear. And who is the main target of this new legislation? Like the activists, LGBTQ plus organizations, or someone else, like any LGBTQ plus person?
As Sasha said in the beginning, I would say that we don't really know who the targets are, because after the court decision, well, the materials are closed and we don't really know who or what is defined as structural parts of this international LGBT movement. I would assume that this is actually a very vague notion, and the government loves using vague notions in terms of legislation. And so it can be applied to anyone they desire. Really. So anybody who brings too much attention, who makes too much noise, who's just disliked somehow in certain maybe region of Russia, they can actually bring this person or this organization under this decision and then criminalize their activity in that sense. So we really shouldn't, make any assumptions here again, because it's hard to do. And we really cannot live in the head of the government. Like there's no particular logic to this. And also I want to say that, well, we always try to assume, that this is connected to elections somehow. Maybe this is something continuing Putin's very famous transphobia, anti-LGBT stance, I think that the system is sort of closing in on itself in terms of, yes, they have like the general policy-making line, but it doesn't mean that they're not going to get creative about it. This might be certain policymakers, might be certain actors within the system who are being very, I would say, in their eyes, probably thorough, and they're willing to fight this LGBT movement till the very end. They might actually even believe that it exists. They're overly zealous. And this is one of the characteristics of the existing system right now. Those who remain, not all of them, of course, but those who remain, the policymakers, they're very overzealous. They're very loyal to the regime. So they want to get rid of every single element that doesn't make sense, that is foreign. Think times of Cold War and two systems that existed, communism and capitalism. So now the Russian government is creating its own system of traditional values. And yes, it's trying to create its own almost like block of friends, like the last bastion of hope for conservative values. And that's an instrument that it uses both in its inner policy and in terms of international policy. So I guess it's somehow like that, in my opinion.
I hear that lots of people pay attention to the fact that such an organization as a international LGBTQ movement doesn't exist, but it actually doesn't matter. This is a completely wrongful decision in its essence, and the lack of legal decency in the small details is neither surprising nor accidental ignorance, I think. If we speaking about risks, I think the risks of direct persecution are higher for public activists or those who have been victims of online harassment. But some random things are also possible. If a fellow major, for example, found extremist symbols on your page on social networks, a rainbow flag, we don't even know what symbols were considered extremist. But to me, it's not right to say that the target of this decision is LGBT activists only. The example of raids on gay clubs shows that this might not be the case. And I think that, for example, transgender people will be especially vulnerable because it's almost physically impossible for them to hide the fact that they are trans people. And this decision will take a huge toll on mental health, and probably some simple things will be much more difficult, like how to find a job, how to rent a flat. It will be very nervous, I think.
So you mentioned the raids on LGBTQ plus clubs, on gay clubs in Moscow in the beginning of December. So what does this mean for you? Is it like a clear signal that there will be like regular raids and repressions on LGBTQ persons, like very random, very unexpected? Like when you read this news, what were your first reactions?
Well, my first reaction was, oh, this is a mess. Because again, we don't know how this is going to be applied. At first, yes, it was assumed that this is aimed only against activists somehow, or those who have been public about their sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, whatever. We just assumed that publicity was a big element of it because it's easier, of course, to persecute the known enemy, quote unquote. But I guess we were wrong in our initial assessment, and that's no surprise really, because it's impossible to predict how this is going to be used. I would assume that this is going to be used as an instrument, once again, instrument of persecution of people and of instilling fear. So this is not, if we talk about the general population, this is almost like creating an atmosphere of fear when you don't really know what action of yours, what symbols that you wear or portray is going to be the reason why they come after you.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we get so many requests from the people who are subscribed to our social media channels, for example, where they ask us questions which previously would never thought imaginable. Things like, okay, so I'm subscribed to some queer artists. Is that going to be a problem if this is found on my social media? Is this how I'm going to be persecuted? Should I even go out to gay clubs? Should I just, stay at home and cry and do nothing? What should I do? And the worst thing is that we don't really know what to tell people. We tell them to be careful. We tell them to just assume that, the symbols like the rainbow or using the LGBT, just the naming, it's going to be problematic, but we don't know. And that's the worst thing in the world. And I guess the raids as well, people are trying to find some logic behind it. For example, in terms of one of the clubs, just yesterday, I saw their press media release where they were saying oh, but we have no part of the international LGBT movement. We're loyal to the regime. We are the local queer people. We're Russian queer people. And they're trying to to sort of play this game along the government lines. They're trying to say that, okay, we are parts of the system, so please don't come after us. But that doesn't mean that people who are homophobic already, people within the system, for example, within legal enforcement, they're not going to use this court decision to their advantage to just come after people and use their authority and their power. Because, well, for example, in different regions of Russia, this could be used differently, and people could just, I guess, use this decision to justify certain actions like police brutality, for example. It doesn't have to make sense in order for the system to use it to come after regular people.
I like the idea of staying at home, generally, not regarding this situation, but just, I don't think that these raids just a day or two after the decision was made. I don't think that these are just coincidences. And I think that police raids are a fairly clear signal that the activities of LGBT clubs now will not be ignored. And this is potentially unsafe for visitors. I would assume that these raids were coordinated, but that's just my assumptions. They may have been carried out only for warning and intimidation. That's a big thing for Russian authorities. They really like it. But as a result of this race, they also collected people's data. Even if they don't use it somehow in the future, it still doesn't look pleasant. And this will make attending any LGBT-related party scary for many LGBT people. But I don't think there will be any need for raids like this in the future, as I guess many gay places will simply close, either on their own due to police pressure or because venue owners will stop rent agreements. I'm kind of pessimistic.
Yeah, Dilya, you also mentioned that in different Russian regions, this legislation might be interpreted and applied in a different way. The repressions against LGBTQ people are severe in some parts of Russia. Do you think that this new legislation might be applied like very differently in different regions, like in the North Caucasus and St. Petersburg?
My whole life, while I was working at Sfera, I've been asked about the state of queer people in the North Caucasus. And I always said, yes, it's very bad. But listen, across Russia, the rights of LGBT people are being abused somehow. It's just happening in a different way. And well, I wasn't always listened to, really, because what was happening in North Caucasus was really sensational. Always it was bloody, it was gory, unfortunately. And now I could say that the situation's gotten worse for the entire country. And finally, I guess I'm going to be asked in the future about the state of LGBT people across the country. I'm trying to find the positives where there's none, to be honest. In the North Caucasus, I think the situation is very peculiar. It's a very specific region in terms of cultural specificity and also in terms of how the federal authorities, the center of the country, approaches the abuse of human rights in this particular region. It's almost like they're closing their eyes to the entirety of it all. And this was happening even before the war, for many years before the war. And that's because the federal authorities don't really want to in any way offend the authorities who preside in the North Caucasus, especially in Chechnya. So it's almost like the Wild West of Russia in terms of nobody really has control over what's happening here. And it's hard to get people out of there. It's hard to provide any sort of assistance to people who are there, who are somehow kidnapped, imprisoned, especially if they're stuck within the system. That's a very complicated story. I don't really think that this decision is going to affect what's happening in the North Caucasus in any major way, because it's already very, very bad. And already they sort of negated the very existence, the authorities in North Caucasus, negated the existence of queer people. If you remember, there are no gay people in Chechnya, right? At least that's what the authorities said many times over. So I'm thinking that this is only going to make it more complicated for human rights defenders to actually provide assistance there. But in terms of any major changes, probably not. It's just going to be bad as it was. Across Russia, I would say that this legislative decision is going to maybe be affecting people more in the places, in the regions, in smaller towns, because it's not as visible, I wouldn't say again that there's going to be a major difference. For example, in St. Petersburg or in Moscow, they could create some cases for show, just to show that, okay, we're closing cases. We're actually, we're mindful of this court decision, because the authorities, especially of legal enforcement in Russia, they really want to show off. And by the end of the year, they also have to close like a certain number of cases. So, why not? Why not use queer people to do that? Such an easy way to go. But in smaller parts of Russia, I would assume that, people might not be as informed. They might actually read about this decision, and they might not get into the peculiarities of what it means and who you're actually supposed to go after. They're just going to use this to use it. They're just going to operate with this decision and say, okay, you are gay and that's bad. This is already extremism. So because we had this happening in the past, we had cases happening in the past when somebody might have been arrested for a completely separate thing, but maybe on their social media, they're openly queer, for example. And so the state authorities in maybe smaller towns, they would say, listen, if you do not go along with us, if you do not cooperate with investigation, we can also accuse you of propaganda. We can also charge you with propaganda. And so, this is again going to be used to scare people into confessions, to scare people into silence, into cooperating with legal enforcement, etc. It's going to be instrumentalized in a major way. And because in smaller parts, well, not smaller parts, but in further away regions of Russia, maybe there are also less human rights organizations willing to help. Maybe they will close down, etc. People won't really know whom to ask, how they should protect themselves. And this is even legal. And that's going to create more persecution, possibly.
That's literally what I said yesterday to another media when they asked me about those raids, and they were like, why? And I was like, why not? Yesterday, I looked at the OVD Info statistics on politically motivated criminal persecutions over the last 10 years in Russia. OVD Info is a human rights project. They are brilliant. So they have recorded cases of persecution in different regions marked on their map. And there are only 13 of them in Chechnya. Why do you think that is? Not because human rights are respected there, but because the persecution there is often doesn't go through the court process. So yeah, of course, Chechnya is an extreme example, but for LGBT people in the North Caucasus in Russia, the reality has always been different from, say, St. Petersburg.
Russian legislation against the LGBTQ community has been gradually tightening for many years. But could you just remind our listeners the major steps of these restrictions against LGBTQ community in Russia during the last 10 years?
It was a law on so-called LGBT propaganda among minors. It was accepted on federal level in 2013, I think, because it firstly appeared on regional levels. So after that, we had a pretty strange attempt to pass the law about transgender people. That was Mizulina's initiative. I don't exactly remember, but they wanted to ban gender legal transition. I think it was in 2020. And there was some stuff about family something. And there was an public campaign. And this law back then, it wasn't accepted. After that, we had a new LGBT propaganda, but now among all ages. Was it this year or the last year?
To me,
It was in December of 2022. They love doing it by the end of the year.
Oh, yeah, right. Cool. And this summer we had a really tragic law which banned medical and legal gender transition in Russia. And right now we have this. We have LGBT people as extremists in Russia.
Because why not?
Yeah, why not?
By the way, in 2020, they also, in addition to discussing some anti-trans people legislature, they actually also introduced constitutional amendments. And one of those constitutional amendments was that they said marriage is only possible between a man and a woman. So it's also something that back then activists fought against, but it was unsuccessful, unlike the campaign against this anti-trans legislative initiative. But, it only took them a couple of years to circle back and do something much worse. Anyways, I also want to say I actually, in the past, in my previous life, before Sfera and everything, I am a political scientist. And for a couple of years, I researched how Russia utilizes the rhetoric of traditional values in its global policy. An interesting thing about that is they first started talking about anti-LGBT legislature and about traditional values at the end of 2011, beginning of 2012. And that was actually in connection to the first first big protests on the precipice of new elections and discussion of corruption around all of that. And they started using this more and more to explain different policies that were pro-family, so to say, in different parts of life. And that was closely connected to anti-LGBT legislature, foreign agents legislature, domestic violence, decriminalization, and so on and so forth. They've actually been doing this for about the last decade. And it's, again, it has nothing to do with the general public's inclination toward conservatism or traditionality or whatever. It's an instrument of a government to try to create very, very loyal, conservative part of people in Russia, create sort of like an idea around the existing government, I would say. So it's, it's been very logical, step by step, sort of beautiful picture, but unfortunately it affects actual, real, breathing people. So yeah, that's problematic.
I totally forgot about changes in constitutions. So many creative things to remember. I totally forgot about the constitution. I mean, who remembers about the constitution in Russia?
Well, I mean, it's supposed to be the higher law of a land,
Yeah,
but
I know.
But again, we're a democracy, right? So why even remember about the constitution? We're already a democracy. Everything's great.
And among the representatives of the Russian authorities, of course, there are also gays. Do you expect repressions to affect them as well?
I once had one activist tell me this thing, and I still remember it to this day. They said, don't think that every single vulnerable person belonging to a vulnerable group is a good person and that they're vulnerable by themselves because there are other factors coming in. So in this instance, when we talk about queer people in politics, again, we don't know who these people are. Most of them are not out, right? And they have no reason to be. They are part of the system. So we shouldn't really think of them as those who are vulnerable. Of course, this is going to be affecting them in a way because they're not going to be able to be proudly out, maybe, but they never had the reason to be. They associate themselves with the system and they have, I would say, a different set of priorities in this sense. One of them, what is his name?
Krasovsky?
Yeah, I always forget his last name. He actually said that, well, of course, this is going to affect me, but I'm loyal to the system. And this is more important. And I understand why this is needed. So he sort of plays along with this agenda, whether he agrees with it or not. And of course, it's sad. These people know what it's like to be queer, right? They are part of a community. However they behave, whatever they say, those who are vocal about what's happening because they're perfectly in the position to do so, and they have some sort of power and authority, in a sense, they are doing the complete opposite because they're doing this for their own gain. And I understand why. They're trying to play along the system. They try to remain comfortable. And this is what most MPs are doing. If they disagree with some policies, they disagree with the war, whatever, they're just too comfortable to change the status quo. It's still, I would say, when this is a part of your identity, playing along the system lines that is persecuting the people who are just the same way as you are, who are also LGBT plus, for example, is a different kind of messed up, I would say. But it's the reality. It's not only the Russian system that it happens in, it's been happening in different systems across the years. It's just how people survive, I guess.
As recently as 20 years ago, the pop group Tattoo, which positioned itself as a lesbian couple, represented Russia at international song competition. Today, we have all this discriminatory legislation in Russia, even in Russian constitution. Has Russian society become much more homophobic in these 20 years with the new legislation? What do you think?
I want to maybe save some bits of optimism that are still remaining within me. I actually want to say that if we look at some numbers, right? And maybe add some qualitative data as well, not only quantitative data. After 2013, federal law that Sasha has mentioned before, when we were recounting all the anti-LGBT legislature that the Russian government's passed, after that legislature was first passed, we saw a certain spike in the number of cases of, I would say, violence against queer people, physical violence, as well as some sort of discriminatory action. And that spike actually didn't hold on for long. So it was supposed that the level of violence would rise in the Russian society afterwards, and it would remain steady or even rise further. But that didn't happen. And I want to attribute that to, I cannot fully, because there is no research that's been done on this, but I want to attribute this to partially the efforts of queer activists all throughout Russia, because the work in terms of raising awareness, in terms of working with the media as well, for example, and sort of talking about what it means to be LGBT plus. And it's not about being some sort of mythical creature. It's just about being a human being, just like everybody else. It could be your neighbor, it could be your child, it could be your parent, whatever. That work was actually instrumental in sort of shifting the landscape. I don't want to say that the Russian society became much less homophobic or transphobic. It's still very much homophobic and transphobic and biphobic. I can continue and just say that it's sort of, very, has a lot of phobias in terms of different identities. But we saw a difference because even as an organization, as a human rights organization, in years before the war, we had more media resources, even not independent media resources, coming into us and asking us about our opinion, our stance on certain issues and situations pertaining to LGBT plus community. We saw businesses coming in and saying, can we do like a collaboration of some sort? And then the proceeds would go to helping queer people, etc. And that wasn't happening in the beginning of 2000s or even the beginning of 2010s, So we saw actually some sort of shift within the society. So I still want to say that despite the discriminatory legislature, we actually have people who are much less homophobic than should have been expected, I guess, despite the climate, the legislative climate. And we have a lot of allies, sometimes we still to this day, even after the court decision, we had so many people writing to us saying, I'm an ally, I really want to help you. Like, can I be a volunteer? Can I contribute somehow? Can I make donations? So it's not completely hopeless. However, if this continues, if now we have a situation where if somebody is LGBT plus and they're vocal about it, they can be called extremist for it, that could change the climate drastically. If there is no discussion within the society, there's no representation for queer people, so they're completely, invisible and their issues are invisible, we might actually regress, and the level of misunderstanding and ignorance about the issues pertaining to the LGBT plus community can rise, potentially even if you really want to get gloomy about it, I would say. We might have a new generation, like the people who will grow up under this regime that's very repressive, that forbids the discussion of sexuality, gender identity, all of it, and women's rights potentially too, actually, seeing how things are going. We might have a completely new generation that sees things very differently, that's extremely repressed also, I want to say, and that lacks understanding of all the peculiarities that pertain to human identity.
I generally agree. Of course, people's opinions, they may change in the wake of homophobic propaganda because the state spends a lot of money on this propaganda. Yes, I said homophobic propaganda, not LGBT propaganda. We cannot claim that Supreme Court in its decision follows the opinion of Russian society. Russians cannot be called some kind of ideological homophobes. We also see that Russian civil society is becoming more inclusive. It is willing to talk about the issues of LGBT people, and independent journalists are really committed to being friendly to LGBT people.
We discussed that the activists and LGBTQ plus organizations are the main target of these new legislative changes. And right after the Supreme Court announced its decision, the DELO organization, which helped LGBTQ people in Russia, announced its closure immediately. Does this mean that there will be no more specialized help for LGBTQ people in Russia?
Of course, the work of LGBT organizations within Russia will become much more difficult, and public work apparently will become impossible, or possible only for a very short period of time. It's important to realize that the visibility of remaining LGBT organizations in Russia will inevitably decline, and supporting those who continue their work is very important and very needed. There are such organizations, they will not go anywhere, and they really need support.
Well, yeah, I wanted to say that there's been actually many queer organizations that have been helping the community for many years all across Russian regions. Some of these organizations were never visible because they operated sort of in the shadows, I want to say. Maybe they held community centers. Maybe they always renamed themselves. There could be many, many different approaches to this. But those human rights organizations and initiatives that helped queer people in Russia, they always survived across many different factors of persecution. They found ways to continue doing this. Of course, there will be more of those now who are simply afraid for their well-being and their liberty, and they will choose to stop their activism. And that makes sense completely because, well, the risks have become just too high. It's about imprisonment. It's about your liberty being taken away. And some of these people, they are not in a position to live the country. They might not be able to. They might have their reasons for staying. So this is about their safety. However, there will be others who continue working. There will be those who leave Russia and will continue working from abroad somehow, because it's possible to do that, to support the community. And there will also be new activists, because new challenges, they actually breed a new generation of activists as well, because when somebody's rights are being infringed upon, inevitably, there will be those who fight against it. And it might be completely new kind of people. And I hope that maybe they will find some instruments that we never thought of. And again, this is just my optimism speaking, but that's just how it works, really. The more there's persecution, the more there's going to be pushback. Maybe not right away, but that's just historically how it's always been. Not only in Russia, I mean.
Dilyara, you also expressed your concern about the new generation, about Russian children who now have not many sources to learn about LGBTQ plus people in Russia. So where could they get information about the queer people today? Because in Russian school there is this traditional values agenda, and how could they learn about the diversity that we have in the world?
We sort of tried to work with this problem for many years now as an organization, because ever since 2013, the law on that sort of banned the so-called propaganda, LGBT propaganda among minors, it's been more and more difficult to work with queer teens, for example. Even if they came for assistance to us, we weren't always in the position to provide such assistance because, well, they were minors and we were still, trying to work and operate within the logic of legislature, because back then there still was at least some logic to it. So it wasn't really possible for us to do that openly. However, last year when Sfera Foundation was closed down and by the Russian Ministry of Justice, the beloved one, the same one, we actually sort of cast away that notion. We started to work with teens openly and provide psychological assistance to them as well. And now, at the background of the recent court decision, we see that queer youth is very panicked because we are getting more and more requests for assistance and questions that don't only pertain to support, direct support, I mean psychological support, but they're also asking, okay, how do I leave the country? Because, it's impossible to continue for me to be here and to be myself and so on and so forth. And we don't really know how to bring about the news that, well, they can't. They're minor, they really can't. And they will have to exist within the system, at least till the moment when they are capable of making their own choices and decisions, and so on and so forth. We're very worried about how they're going to be affected within the school system, even, or even the university system, because, well, it's a very homophobic environment. We actually did a research, I think, back in 2021, where we learned that it's actually the school specialists who contribute to this in a major way, because they sort of also bully queer teens. They say things that are homophobic and transphobic as well, and not very sensitive of their identity. But we also continue working with school psychologists and social workers. We actually have like a database of over 100 people from different regions of Russia who are queer friendly and who try to work with us to come up with strategies to continue supporting queer teens in a way that wouldn't draw attention of school administration or authorities. But it's becoming more and more difficult, and people are more and more scared. So I'm not very optimistic about the prospects of this.
I just remembered how my teacher said that today you lose your notebook and tomorrow you go to prison, and apparently she was right. Children and teenagers in Russia actually don't learn about diversity in school. It kinda has always been like this. But how do children and teenagers learn anything? Well, I think from life and from the internet. I mean, enemies climb into all the cracks. Ambiguous looking musicians, natural phenomena after rain, anime. I'm kidding, of course. But also there are a project that comes to my mind is Children 404, Дети 404 in Russian. They provide LGBT teenagers in Russia sort of internet space where they can send their worries and they can gain some support from the comments.
Regarding this, should we now expect mass migration of LGBTQ people from Russia? If so, which countries will be the easiest for them to move to, like the most friendly countries for LGBTQ people from Russia?
I would say that definitely right now it's very hard to say because, well, we can assume in terms of activists, of course, that most of them who have been public, whose activity can be tied to certain organizations that, maybe were registered or non-registered, but still their links can be found, they will opt for leaving the country if it's at all possible for them because it's a question of their safety. However, in terms of the LGBT plus community overall in the country, I would say that yes, many will leave, but many more will stay because we always sort of just assumed, that everybody is going to be leaving because it's so very hard to continue living in Russia as a queer person. But the thing is, most of them don't have the means or the opportunity to do that. They can come to organizations providing assistance like ours, even, for example. And yes, we can help them. We can cover some expenses for the first time being, pay for their ticket, etc. But they have to build their lives anew somewhere else after that. And we cannot help with that. In terms of social integration and so on and so forth, it's always sort of the experience that cannot really be 100% guaranteed in terms of positive outcome. Even after the beginning of the war, 2022, many people left because they were really panicky. And then a certain percentage came back because they couldn't build their life somewhere else. And I'm afraid to say that this is going to be the case for queer people as well. And I'm afraid to say that because they won't be able to be completely themselves, they won't be able to feel safe, and yet they will have to continue living in the country. And we can't really take everybody out because even if there aren't a lot of queer people in Russia, it's still a number too big for human rights organizations. So yeah, unfortunately, I wouldn't say it's going to be mass migration, but we're going to have many activists who leave. So it's going to be some sort of helping force that is going to leave the country as well. And that's going to maybe possibly negatively affect the state of helping human rights organizations across the country. Because yes, some of them, they will rebuild their activity, they will continue their activism, they will continue to help, and some of them won't. So
I absolutely agree with Dilya on this question. A lot of LGBTQ people in Russia now are thinking about migration, but I think that most of them just don't have such an opportunity. I'd like to say that these new risks are very serious and it changes many things. For example, previously you could get, okay, a fine for LGBTQ propaganda. It would be unpleasant, but it is manageable. But right now, the government says that you can face prison for who you are and who you cannot stop being. Well, they not put it like this, but due to the very vague nature of this decision, it seems possible, and it is very serious. You're very welcome to support Russian LGBTQ organizations because many of them will now lose their donations from Russian supporters because it's just unsafe, like to give your money to an extremist organization. You may face prison for that as well. So please raise awareness about what's happening. And as I mentioned before, Russian LGBTQ organizations will be very grateful for your help and support.
That's all for this episode. Thank you for listening to Russia on the Record and following us on social media. See you next time.